Hello and welcome to our Aviation Leader series. I'm delighted to have John Higgins with us today. To introduce John, I would just say that he's had almost 30 years of experience in the aircraft leasing and finance sector. He's a founding partner of the aircraft leasing firm Avolon in 2010. He served as its president and chief commercial officer from its launch until stepping down in 2021. John was a member of the Board of Avolon during this time, which saw the company successfully launched an IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, complete a number of significant capital raises and M&A transactions, and grew the business to become a top 3 lessor. Prior to Avolon, John held senior executive roles in RBS Aviation Capital, GCAS and GPA. He's currently a board member and shareholder in Emerald Airlines, the exclusive operator of the Aer Lingus regional network. He is also an investor in Optifly, a leading supplier of the next generation schedule optimization software to low-cost airlines. He's a fellow chartered accountant and holds a Business of Science Management degree from Trinity College Dublin. John, you're very welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
John, we have a number of recent graduates and people who are entering into the aviation finance sector. Could we just start off learning a little bit about your background, how you got into aviation finance, and tell us a little bit about your career today?
Happy to do that. So, I guess when I was in graduating, it was 1990s specifically, and if you were looking around Ireland as a graduate, prospectively looking for work or areas to work in, it was a pretty bleak scenario. I mean, this was pre-Celtic Tiger, pre-everything, but there was one company kept on it had a pretty high profile and it seemed to be very attractive, which was GPA. And against a backdrop where other companies seemed to be struggling and not huge amounts of sort of growth or activity, GPA always seemed to be the outlier. GPA was talking about growing and being dominant globally, and it sounded like a fantastically interesting place to work. So that sort of was on my radar. Was that's an interesting sector, but what I decided to do, like a lot of people like yourself, I said, well, I'll go off and I'll get an accountancy qualification, not because I ever wanted to work as an accountant, with due respect to it, but it was regarded as a very good business qualification, a very general business qualification. So I joined Pricewaterhouse. I did a couple of stints in New York and Boston. I did stints down in Tullamore and Athlone in manufacturing companies. So I did the full thing for 3.5 years, but always with an eye on to I wanted to work in aviation, probably aircraft financing rather than operational, but I did try. I wrote to Richard Branson. I said I'd come and work for him for free for 6 months if he'd give me a chance. But when I was qualified, it so happened there was an opportunity open at GPA for the position of treasury manager. And I knew very little about treasury and I had no real interest in it. But I did realize that if I could get my foot in the door, then I'd learn, and then I'd be in a much better place in 12 months' time to maybe explore other parts of aircraft leasing and aircraft financing that wouldn't be open to me if I stayed in practice or if I went and joined a manufacturing company. So I had that interest. I was lucky that there was an opportunity, but it wasn't by any means the ideal job spec for me or the right profile for me. But I knew that GPA was full of very experienced, talented people. GPA at the time was in distress. Their IPO had failed, and normally in distress there's opportunity. So I joined as treasury manager, and suddenly I was doing a lot of treasury work, but I was doing a huge amount of work working on refinancing, how are we going to make this company solvent again, what M&A landscape is out there or whatever. So that's how I got into it. And
never waste a good crisis.
Well, that's the truth, right? In crisis, there's a lot of there are a lot of challenges and all that. But because things are changing, when things are changing, there's opportunities to innovate or to be opportunistic or to arbitrage markets, whatever. So that's how I got into aircraft leasing, and it was that was then. If you go back to early 90s, 1993, I think 94. That was the time then when globally traffic numbers were starting to rise, the manufacturers started to increase production rates, low-cost carriers became a thing, old airlines started to reinvent themselves. So it was actually a very interesting time to be involved in a sector that was feeding off a fundamentally changing aviation landscape.
Did Richard Branson ever get back to you?
He did.
Oh, did he?
He did. And there's a nice little segue in that, because he wrote back to me and said, "Thanks very much. I've passed your resume on to Nigel." He was the CFO, Nigel Primrose, who was the CFO of Virgin Atlantic. And Nigel wrote to me and said, "Thanks very much. We have your, we put it on file and we'll get back to you if there's any." In other words, like, and I had said, "I'll work for you for free for 6 months. What can I lose?" And then, so I went to GPA, and 2.5 years after I went to GPA, I went to GCAS in a junior marketing role. And one of the customers I was given to look after was Virgin Atlantic. So I ended up going over and meeting Nigel Primrose. And one of the first things I said to him was, "You have I said I'd work for you for free. It's my application is on file." He went, the secretary went and got it and brought it in.
Fantastic.
So, and I ended up doing a significant deal on some 747s with Virgin. So there you go.
It's a small industry, isn't it? Yeah.
Small world.
Very good. And funny, a number of people have said in the series that they tried to get into the industry knowing that they would move and learn different roles within the organization. So as they moved up the career ladder, they'd actually understand each of the departments that they were dealing with. And I think it's always a good piece of advice to understand each different parts of the business.
Yeah. And you know, that remains the case today. You know, there's a lot of fluidity in aircraft leasing companies where people will come in, you know, as a trained lawyer to work in a legal department, and 5 years later they're working as the marketing person in, you know, Southeast Asia or whatever, or vice versa. So there's a lot of potential, but you need to come in and sort of learn the ropes of the industry first.
And in GCAS, you dealt with marketing.
Yeah, I was part of the European marketing team, but EMEA, and again working with, you know, some of the people who had been involved in the launch of GPA. So people who'd been, you know, employee number 4, 5, 6, whatever, of the original GPA, they were the pioneers who were defining what aircraft leasing meant, and they were real deal makers. They were real. Very strong entrepreneurial spirit, very strong innovation in terms of how to get things done, because to some degree the industry has matured now. Back then it was much less defined in terms of what could be done or how things could be done, and legal advice and tax advice and financing was much more difficult. So they were very innovative, and for me, literally it was like joining, you know, a team of sort of galacticos, and you could learn osmosis. Right? You learn from them. So I did a number of years there in GCAS, and then I left to join RBS Aviation Capital. At the time when RBS had decided that not only was it going to be the biggest bank in the world, it was going to be the dominant player in aviation finance, and Peter Barrett and Donald Slattery, they had gone there. And they asked me to go and join them. And, you know, we pretty much from a very low base, we built a very large aircraft financing business, which was a very successful business, both operating, leasing and debt, and remained very successful until RBS at a parent level blew itself up. We were left with I suppose the challenge was that we had a good business that was profitable and well managed from a risk perspective. We were sitting in a bank that had just, you know, blown itself up, and we weren't a problem, and so therefore we got put on the back burner. And you mentioned earlier David Swan has done this talk. He probably referenced the same thing, where it was very frustrating for us because we had a good team, very good franchise, could see huge opportunity in the market, but we were owned by a bank that had no capital to fuel our ambition to grow. We weren't a problem, so we weren't being dealt with. So we were sort of stuck in the backwater, and that was frustrating, and particularly so as we could see that the need for aircraft finance was greater than it ever had been, because there were so many banks that had been, you know, completely sort of wiped their balance sheet, their capacity to lend. Well, they'd either gone bust or their capacity to lend had been seriously diluted. There were leasing companies that couldn't refinance their debt. So we were looking on, God, if we could be in this marketplace, you know, And out of that, a number of us left and we started Avalon, where, the difficulty wasn't in, firstly, the difficulty, when I say it wasn't difficult to raise equity, it's always a challenge, but the private equity firms that we were talking to, they could see the same opportunity that we were talking about. So they could understand it. The challenge was, could you leverage, you could raise the equity, but could you raise the debt?
Mm.
And that was really the sort of the hinge point around whether or not we could get Avalon launched formally. So we ended up with 3 private equity firms who each committed $250 million. So $750 million of equity, but we were, struggling to get debt to make that sort of effective capital, to make it capital that could earn the equity returns that were expected. And we had a lot of near misses on that. We had a lot of promises that didn't come to fruition. And I remember particularly, I think it was April 2010, where we felt we finally had, I think there was 5 banks in the original warehouse facility to get us launched. And we went to London to sign up the documentation. And literally when we were in London, the Icelandic ash cloud happened.
I remember it all.
So, and the banks literally said, game off here. We're not committing, that amount of money to an aircraft leasing business, when at the time the headlines were, people may never fly again. Like, I know it sounds ridiculous, but people were saying that. And, it took Willie Walsh and others to take airplanes up and fly through the cloud and say, look, we're still here. But we ended up actually leaving London not knowing if we had any debt facility left in terms of to be documented. And the ultimate irony was the way we got back from London was by getting a train to Holyhead and getting the ferry back to Dublin. So we're trying to launch an aircraft leasing business. We've raised almost $1 billion in equity, and the debt had at very least gone very, very cold, but we managed to resurrect it.
Yeah.
And then, the Avalon sort of journey took off then. But
that's very interesting because as an entrepreneur, I think people are interested in the downs as well as the ups, because it's not everybody who can be an entrepreneur because of those extremes that you have to go through, I think. And you hear a lot of people learning to fail fast, so they go on to the next thing. Is that something you always wanted to be, an entrepreneur, or is it just something that the opportunity arose? How did you kind of come to the decision that I'm going to take the risk and go?
I think that was something that evolved for me because, if you go back, when I graduated, I was saying, okay, well, I need to build a career and I'll go and get the accountancy qualification. That's not a natural entrepreneurial sort of direction to take. But I was taking that with a view towards, it's more of a sort of an MBA type qualification than it is a, functional expertise qualification. So I always had a sort of a sense, that I would like to do things. I just through family connections, I've been involved in a few different sort of catering businesses and hospitality businesses. So I actually thought if I was going to do something entrepreneurial, it would be in that. I looked at opening a pizza chain in Dublin, I don't know, like 30 years ago, and that almost happened or whatever. So there was some part of me that was open to taking a risk, I guess, where if I felt that I understood the space well enough to sort of manage that risk. So with aircraft leasing, I've been working in aircraft leasing for 16 years by the time we launched Avalon. So I felt equipped enough to say, well, there is a huge market opportunity here. I understand what it takes to try and get that done. And don't forget, there was a team of us there, similar mindset. So it was a calculated risk. It wasn't an AI type thing. I don't really understand what that is, but it seems to be very interesting. I'm going to back the house on it. So it was quite measured, quite sort of analytical. But what I learned was that the things that I focused most on as risks when I was trying to assess whether or not it would be a good idea to go and work with the team to set up Avalon was the biggest risks turned out to be things that I hadn't factored in at all, whatever, So you think you've put the thing in a box and measured it and sort of calibrated all the risks. Actually, most of those risks didn't materialize, other ones did. And likewise opportunities, right?
Yeah, the things you don't know.
Exactly, right.
And so let's talk about Avalon. We move on to Avalon. You set it up coming across in the ferry. And I remember reading a quote that when you first started up, one of you or one of your colleagues had mentioned that you were like FC Barcelona. You were so intuitive, and there wasn't all the process in place that you could make a pass and expect one of your co-founders or colleagues to be there to pick up the ball. How was it when you first started Avalon? Did you have a pipeline of work? Did you have to try and scramble? How did you bring that to what is now the third largest lessor with 1,000+ aircraft, 120 clients in 64 countries? A success story by any standards. Those early days, how did that work?
So I think probably all of the above, right? I don't know about the FC Barcelona thing, but we knew each other very well. So and we'd worked together, which that's a great place to start. So there was no unknowns or no sort of punts in terms of the people. So you're looking at the market, you're saying clearly there's a huge market opportunity, and just to remind people, so it's 2010, the world's banks are on their knees. This is post Lehman, but still. People want to travel. Airlines have significant orders in place with the manufacturers. They need to be paid for, et cetera, et cetera. So the market opportunity was huge. We'd worked together. We'd worked together in different types of leasing companies. So some of us had worked together in GPA. Some of us had worked together in GE. Other people had been in, a lot of us had been together in RBS. So there was an innate understanding of everybody's respective strengths and weaknesses, or how we would work together. But we were also quite good, I think, at risk management. I mean, we took it seriously. We didn't, and I know, I hear stories of other leasing companies at different points in time where risk is it's in the org chart, but it's not. But we actually went the other way, and we said, well, we're going to do this properly, and that actually was a big part of, I think, of how we managed to raise so much capital, both at launch and then subsequently, because we were serious about it, and we made a significant sort of part of our franchise. We were talking to banks or equity investors or even airline customers. We'd say, well, we're big into managing risk, so we'll only buy certain types of assets, and we'll only take on certain types of finance, and so. Even though, yes, I think there was 11 of us kind of on day one. So there's not much of an org chart there, but we had a way of thinking about our business, which was, two sides of the balance sheet. So there's the assets, there's the airplanes that we know, sort of the types that we want to invest in. Then there's financing and funding, which is what ultimately blew up GPA. They focused on placing huge orders with the manufacturers and had, 25-year assets with 5-year financing, which doesn't work. So we placed as much, if not more, emphasis on that other side of the balance sheet. So we're not going to blow this company up through making silly short-term decisions on financing or capital structure or hedging or anything like that. The asset side is sort of deep in our DNA. This other side is where we're going to focus our efforts. But yeah, look, it was all of what you said. There was we did a couple of small portfolio trades to buy airplanes and sort of get the debt facilities at least bedded down and working. We had good Rolodex of contacts around the world with the airlines and with the manufacturers, and the market was generally starved of capital. So that was a good place to start. A lot of inbound inquiries, a lot of old relationships where people would pick up the phone and say, look, would you take a look at this? And, one of the things that I think made a significant difference was that when we launched the business, we had, when I say a team, we're talking single number of people. We had a person in China, a person in Hong Kong, a person in New York, and then, the rest of us in Dublin. But at least we felt like a global business. And we looked like a global business because if we brought you in for a presentation, we'd say we have offices in New York, in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, in Dublin. And even though we were 11 people, we were thinking like a global business. And that's how we saw ourselves, that's how we projected ourselves. And, that's where the market was. The market wasn't in Dublin, that's for sure, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess, it was just, and then you start to build, you start to hire more people, you start, we one of the biggest things I think that where I really felt that we had crossed a very significant threshold was about 18 months into the journey. We wanted to raise more equity, and we brought in the government of Singapore. GIC came in as an equity investor, but as part of that equity raise, the existing equity providers also re-upped on their commitment. That's where you sort of say, okay, so the first time around they were backing a business plan and an idea. This time around they're actually backing a business.
Yeah.
And there was a sort of a change, a shift in, I would say, the relationship we had then with the private equity guys, whatever. They sort of felt, okay, you guys know what you're doing. Now it's about how do we accelerate it and grow it or whatever. Whereas the first 12 months were probably more about proof of concept, proof of our ability to work together, proof of our ability to, deal with our shareholders professionally, all of that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean,
it was the second difficult album of the band.
Yes, I hadn't thought about it like that,
Yeah.
right? But
yeah. that financing structure, it's if we could talk a little bit about that, because it's interesting, because as I say, it's now a case study in an MBA program of moving from private equity to investment grade.
Yeah.
And you moved as an organisation through that from high cost finance of private equity, moving to banks on unsecured and secured loans, IPO, which I'd love to hear about, and then to bringing it to an investment grade organisation. That's some transformation in such a short period of time. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, happy to do that. And I guess it sounds a bit simplistic, but we had a vision for where we needed to take the balance sheet. And it to some degree, so we started with, well, where do we want to get to? And that's sort of the North Star. And then anything we do, is just incremental steps to try. You don't get there overnight in terms of, we're a IG issuer with access to, US capital markets. So it's just that you start with a small number of banks with pretty inflexible and pretty expensive warehouse type structures, which are painful operationally, painful financially, whatever. But you build confidence then, and you bring in other banks into those warehouse facilities, and then over time maybe you try and optimize the structuring a little bit more, push the advance levels up a little bit, make the things more operationally friendly, bring the price down. Then you start to migrate into bringing other banks in. Other banks come in on bilateral stuff. So you're constantly managing. Like I say, attention to and huge kudos actually to Andy Cronin, the current CEO of Avalon, because Andy was leading that as CFO and head of capital markets. He had a lot on his plate, but he had a very clear picture of where he wanted to bring the balance sheet to and what needed to happen sort of as interim sort of steps. The IPO was private equity typically has, wants to earn a return of sort of double their money in 5 years. That's general rule of thumb. And that's what they wanted to sort of, achieve with Avalon. So after about 3 years, they start to look at, okay, so what's the exit landscape looking like? And so you do a huge amount of work. We worked with a bunch of different investment banks on, okay, who is the next natural owner of this business? And that could be, it could be a sovereign wealth fund. It could be an existing player. It could be a bank who, now with a rehabilitated balance sheet wants to put more capital to work in the space. And you sort of build out all those different scenarios. And one of the scenarios was, or we could take the business public. And that was probably viewed as one of the least likely outcomes, because the PE guys want to be able to monetize their investment. And whereas you can do that in part through an IPO, then, you know, you have to then have subsequent monetization events in order for them to get their capital back out. So typically, I won't say that they don't like, but they're, you know, there's a clear preference. If you're a PE, like, great, build a business, 5 years, somebody comes in, writes me a check, I get my money back, everybody's happy. So, but as we were sort of going through that process, there was, you know, I suppose, in terms of appetite in different buckets, you know, there wasn't a natural consolidator coming in. We had a couple of banks who were very interested to buy the business, but as it went up the chain at board level, I'm talking like big global banks, it was just seen as too risky a space, which actually it isn't, it wasn't, right? But that was people would equate, and back then, again, this is, you know, 9 years ago, but people would equate airlines with aircraft leasing companies. You say, because that is, like, it's a totally erroneous comparison. You know, back then, yeah, airline stock prices would be going up and down. There's huge operational risk, and the margins are very thin, and they're massively capital consumptive. Aircraft leasing companies are financing businesses with, you know, strong risk-adjusted returns, with a history of, you know, strong recovery and maintenance of capital, but still, it you know, didn't happen. And, you know, the public markets, though, were looking to be an attractive option. So you're always sort of iterating between keeping all options open. We did a non-deal roadshow in about August 2014, and it was, you know, generally speaking, the idea of a public offering was being pretty well received. A lot of the fund managers, the pension managers, or whatever, were quite enthusiastic. They actually understood our business because we simplified it for them, and only these types of assets, only financed in this type of way. Huge market opportunity there. Very experienced people. So we sort of started to skew more towards doing the IPO. But when we did the IPO in December 2014, perversely, if you go back, one of the reasons that GPA failed was that there was a Gulf War back in the 1992. Oil price skyrocketed. Aviation was seen as a risk-off asset, and GPA weren't able to refinance their debt obligations, largely due to that backdrop of high oil. And we were trying to get our IPO done in December 2014, and oil prices had tanked. They were low. So actually the biggest headwind we had when we did the roadshow for the IPO was being asked constantly, so oil is so cheap now, all of the older airplanes that were massively fuel inefficient, they all come back into play now, and all the airplanes that are parked in the desert are going to come back into play. So your idea of investing in young, fuel-efficient airplanes doesn't really hold water. It's undermined by that. Mm-hmm. And we were saying, that how can it be that, you know, GPA's IPO failed because oil was high, and our IPO is under pressure because oil is low, yeah. Right? But anyway, look, we got there. We downsized the amount of the initial offering, and we got the deal done in December, which then gave us currency. So you're now a public company, US public company, which, you know, carries very significant, asks or expectations on regulation and governance or whatever. And we were ready for that because we built the business to allow for that. But at least we were in the game. We had currency, we had a stock that was trading, and we got the deal done. And at the time, I don't know, is it still? This always surprised me. One of our, Jonathan Neelan, who was our from FTI, who was our sort of comms advisor, he said, I've been doing some research. This is the largest IPO that's ever been done by an Irish company on the New York Stock Exchange. We're going we only raised like $250 million or whatever. And he said, yeah, it is. And I think it still is, right? By an Irish, if you like, founded company, which still doesn't make sense to me, right? But that's, we were out, we were in the market, and, that set a new course now. So we're now a public company. We have to focus on continuing to grow the business, deliver the quarterly earnings, build the confidence of the public markets. And then, within 6 months, we had essentially a bidding process going between two Chinese entities. One of them was state-owned, another was privately owned. And that resulted by the end of, we were public basically for a year. By the end of that year, 2015, we were taken private by Bohai. And, if you'd invested in our stock day one on the IPO, you would have made 55% in a year in terms of the takeout price. And then
great return.
Great, hindsight is great in that.
Yeah.
So the private equity guys were then gone, and we now had a new ownership who had, I would say, huge ambition for the business, and there was substance to their ambition in that they, I would say, 1 month after we closed the deal, they gave us $1.6 billion of growth equity to go. We want this business to be a bigger, more successful version of the business that it is today. Go and execute on that, which was fantastic to have as a shareholder, and they also had I suppose a strong aviation pedigree as well in terms of coming from a Chinese airline group. So they understood the sector. They understood the industry. They had capital that they wanted to deploy, and we were the vehicle that they had chosen to do that. So that was fantastically exciting.
With a shareholder like that, and then Oryx coming on board, did you find any difference in how the business operated, or did you kind of go, obviously growth and even more power behind you, but was it business as usual, or did you have that freedom to operate, or was it a different scenario with those shareholders? It
was different, but different faces around the board table, but the same principle of and I give them credit for it. They understood that in order for their investment in Avalon to be a successful investment for them, they needed to allow the business to continue to operate the way it had been operating, with good governance and good rigor and good oversight and all of that, but not with sort of a claustrophobic level of oversight or different procedures or different transaction review procedures or whatever. So they were smart enough and confident enough and brave enough to allow us to do that. So and in many respects, what we saw was this is an opportunity for us to use the relationships that were in place between HNA and the manufacturers, because HNA were already a significant customer for Boeing and Airbus and Embraer and the engine manufacturers, to sort of use that. So with the idea of like the joint sort of purchasing of airplanes, look at how much of our combined balance sheet, So it was a very interesting, very exciting time, and they were alive to all of that and supportive of all of that. And then Oryx coming in, as you say, they came in for a 30% shareholding. And again, Oryx have been in the space for decades, and a sophisticated business, have seen cycles, have seen how assets behave, lease rates behave. They came in, they were convinced in terms of the opportunity that existed for them to make a strategic investment in Avalon, plus at the same time retaining their own platform, sort of more focused maybe on slightly older airplanes, slightly different end of the market, certainly access to Japanese tax markets that nobody else would have. But that was all very, very interesting and very, I suppose, accretive. So now you've got a huge Japanese trading house as a shareholder. You've got a huge Chinese airline / aviation group as a shareholder. We have growth capital. There's lots of interesting opportunities in the market, and the business had great momentum.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about growing your market share in the M&A transactions you did. So CIT obviously is one. and there's others. Could you talk a little bit about the opportunities you saw in M&A transactions, how you went about them, and what worked well for you growing the business?
Yeah, so I can't speak for every leasing company, but I think, there'd be very few of the large leasing companies that aren't always have the radar on for what scale opportunities are out there and how could a deal be done that would be accretive financially, right? Not simply what deals could be done that would make us a bigger business, right? So that sweep is constantly ongoing, and on any given day, there are investment banks in Dublin, given the centrality of Ireland to the sector, going around touting ideas, trying to get a bit of momentum going in dialogue. So that's every significant leasing company that has growth ambition, in addition to looking at order books or portfolio trades, always has a weather eye on the M&A landscape and who might be a seller and what would a deal look like and how could we make sense of that. So that was our view as well, and we, as part of when HNA bought us, we then took over. They had a small aircraft leasing company, Hong Kong Aircraft Finance, and so we had sort of done that, but that was more of an in-house tidy up than a market-based arm's length M&A. So you're just looking all the time, and then sometimes you find, well, look, there's a business there, it's gettable, but either the asset base isn't what we would ideally want, or there's too much of a geographical bias in it. It's too much in China, or it's too much in India, or it's whatever. By the time you fix that, or the financing structures that they have in place are not flexible enough, and they're so you look and you do the work and you conclude that doesn't work. But when CIT was being brought to the market, we looked and we said, okay, there's a strong positive overlap here in terms of the portfolio, the order book position, and the returns on the book were good, and the assets were sort of mostly mainstream assets that we could finance, and we built up enough, I suppose, franchise in the financing markets to be able to sort of go and do that. So the CIT deal for us seemed to be, attractive, ticked all those boxes. Then you get into a process, then you're making your bids, you're trying to maintain your shape in terms of there is a price at which it doesn't make sense. What does a future business look like? Bring two businesses together into one business, and we had plans, we had very detailed plans for that, and literally that happened overnight. In terms of when it closed, everybody in CIT came in to work the next day, had an Avalon iPad, an Avalon iPhone, an Avalon email address, and I know that sounds like small stuff. There's a lot of effort goes into that, but it's also very important, so you don't end up with two businesses under one roof. What we used to say was that day we all joined a new company.
Yeah.
Which was just this new big version of Avalon's bigger than the old Avalon. So everybody has left the old Avalon, and for the CIT people, they're coming to this new bigger business as well. So we're all joining this business together. So very interesting. And that analysis, I mean, if you look at what M&A deals have happened, some deals that wouldn't have been conscionable in terms of GCAS trading or ILFC trading or whatever, and AirCap have been very nimble and how they've done deals at that scale. So that's a constant sweep that's on.
Yeah. And there's always a talk of kind of consolidation in the market as well, and opportunities for those mergers and trials. One thing I wanted to ask you was that merger brought up a thing about transforming a business, the leadership, empowering the team, and you came up with Tribe.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in Tribe because it's very clear and it's set out. You might talk about the E a little bit for us.
Yes.
But you might just explain about Tribe, because I think having that culture within an organization obviously helps with those type of transactions, but also to move an organization forward. So what's Tribe?
So Tribe is the values of Avalon. I should say, by the way, just to remind you, I haven't worked in Avalon since the end of 2021, right? And the business continues to be successful. And I heard this morning when I was driving the radio, they closed a $750 million debt facility yesterday involving Middle Eastern and Indian banks. I haven't read up on that, but that's very, very interesting. So to me, that's just a new innovation. Well done, Andy and the team. So in other words, if I'm talking about Avalon here, it's, with full respect to the fact that it's a continuing successful business. But back, the values piece came very early in the day, probably 2012 maybe, where we wanted to have something that defined the business that wasn't simply the logo, or so what are we about? What defines this business? What defines how we work or who we are? And I would be generally speaking a healthy skeptic on a lot of corporate BS type stuff. But I fundamentally, we, the management team, we believed in the idea that a business needs to be able to define itself in terms of values. And that wasn't necessarily, a massively popular or populist thing back then. It's 12 years ago. It is now, but it wasn't necessarily back then. And even though we had, a very small number of people, we set up individual teams, people with a mix from different parts of the business, and asked them to go off and go out for dinner, whatever, but come back with ideas or words or concepts that you think define the business. So through that process and a bit of distilling, we ended up with TRIBE. So transparency, respect, insightfulness or innovation, bravery, and she asked me to talk ebullience or fun, right? So very simply, transparency, you just got to be straight with people, internally, externally, whatever. Don't be trying to, sort of weave or navigate around people. Just be open. Like it's much easier to get things done if everybody feels everybody has been straight up. I know that's easier said than done.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean being naive in negotiation. It's not like saying to a customer, well, the lease rate I'm asking for is 370, but I'll settle for 350. That's not transparent. That's silly, right? Yeah. But it is, it is only engaging with the customer if you really want to try and get a deal done, not just tire kicking or wasting their time, whatever. Respect speaks for itself. And the way we used to describe that was if it's literally a one-day part-time person who's come in to work on the reception desk to cover illness for one of the versus the CEO of the company, there's huge disparity there in terms of authority, in terms of compensation, but there's no disparity in terms of respect. So everybody is entitled to the same level of respect from everybody, and that's not a negotiation. That's given. If you can't live with that, you're not going to enjoy working here. Insightfulness, bit of a clumsy word, but that was just think about different ways, better ways to do things. Is there a better way? We're much more interested in changing, finding new ways of doing things than reinforcing, oh, that's how we've always done it for the past 10 years. And we're very serious about that. So we want people to really think about, so this 10-page document that we put in place every time, does anybody ever read it afterwards? And so just a level of innovation, but all of that, I think the most important one for me was the B part, right? So bravery. So bravery is for me the facilitator of all the others. So you've got to be prepared to, put yourself out there. You've got to be prepared to call people out. You've got to be prepared to be called out, whatever. So you've got to be brave. If you're brave, everything else can work. You can drive all of these other values. If you're not, then it's hard. It's hard to be pushing new ideas or new thinking, because that travels with bravery, because you have to be prepared to say, I think there's a better way to do it. And then ebullience was just basically to say, look, when we're doing all of these things, we want to have fun. So the strapline we used and we definitely lived to was, we take what we do very seriously. We don't take ourselves very seriously. And that was, we actually found a very good space to sort of, to balance that. So, we take what we do very seriously. At one stage, we're a US public company, we have filings, we have obligations, we have governance. This is not stuff that we can be flippant about. So we just want excellence in terms of work, governance, commitment, professionalism. But we want to have a lot of fun when we're doing that. And so we worked hard to try and bring that in as well as a value in the company, so that people would not see it written down. Like, we didn't want people to have a handbook saying, oh, where's the values? That's up at the back page somewhere near the, who do you contact for life insurance, whatever. The values were plastered all over the walls, spoken about all the time, brought into meetings. And people would actually say, in a meeting, say, look, on the value of transparency, I want to be straight here. I think this team has whatever, is going the wrong way on this project. And so that's transparent and it's brave and it's all that. But it became part of the operating language of the business rather than a bunch of values at the back page of a handbook that nobody ever reads. Which, when I worked in GE in the in the 90s, that was the type, like, values. Jack Welch would think about values, every couple of years. Everybody would be given a card with the values on it. You go into the back of your wallet or go into your drawer beside the stapler, and that was it. Never heard of it again. Whereas in Avalon, the values were critically important.
There's a book, Good to Great, which talks about getting the right people in the right seats on the bus and being brave then to discuss how you progress the business. And I think that's something that's obviously you've done there in Avalon. But also on the fun side, I do remember seeing a crew of you doing a flash dance for Star Wars out near Stratford Street. So, really living the values, I think.
100%. I love that. And I've got 3 teenage kids now, and I keep on saying to them, like, you think you're cool, but look what we did.
Yeah,
right? Get back to me when you're playing, Champions League cool.
Yeah.
But that's the type of thing we did, and not just that. We in day-to-day office interactions, we like to find the opportunity to be serious, but keep it light, and people will respond much more to that than if everything feels heavy and rigid and whatever. So
let's talk a little bit about post-Avalon. So obviously you left a number of years ago. And Emerald Airlines, you're on the board.
I am.
The regional carrier for Aer Lingus. Tell me how you got involved in that and what you see for Emerald Airlines in the next few years.
So, there was Conor McCarthy, who many people will know. Conor and I have been friends for a long time. In fact, one of the first deals I did in GCAS was I sold Ryanair a 737-200. And Conor was the chief operating officer of Ryanair at the time, and it was a difficult deal. The airplane was coming out of a bankruptcy in India. We spent a fortune on it to sort of get it ready, but it went into service with Ryanair, and every second day the airplane, and Conor would call me and to give me, even though we'd sold him the airplane, it wasn't my airplane anymore, but he'd call me just to give me an update on the latest woe and problem with the airplane. But through that, we actually developed a good relationship. And then when Conor left Ryanair, I had through another contact in a law firm, Tony Fernandez, who was in record company executive. He ended up calling me. He said, "Oh, I've been given your name. I want to start an airline in Asia, a low cost carrier." And I was like, "Oh, Christ almighty!" Right. So, but I spoke to Tony a good few times. He sent me sort of versions of the plan, which at the first stage included wide body. I was like, cut that out. But then he got down into it. He said, "Well, how many crews do I need? What should I be budgeting?" And I said, "You know what? This is not my area of expertise, but I know somebody you should talk to." So I introduced Conor to Tony, and one of the hardest negotiations I've ever had, because there's two guys who have a strong entrepreneurial sort of DNA and a strong sort of sense of my own worth, So in terms of, that's fine, I'm happy to talk to the guy, but he can come to me and I'm happy to talk to the guy. So I managed to get the two of them to meet in Stansted Airport, and they both called me after that and said, that's a smart guy there, I think there's something in. So I had sort of introduced Connor to AirAsia, and then Tony called me, he said, well, why didn't you come to Kuala Lumpur? You're an accountant, you can be the CFO of the airline. I said, no, like, it would be the worst decision for your airline and for me to pretend that I would be equipped to be the CFO of an airline. So I didn't do that. But so I go back a long way with Connor, and then through then business dealings. When I was in RBS, we were a big financier for AirAsia, both on the aircraft side, also on the oil and currency derivatives and stuff like that. So we had always said at some stage we must do something together. So Connor came to me literally at about the time when we were Donald and Tom and Andy and myself were like, okay, so this is now the next generation. We're going to be exiting in the next 12, 18 months. And Connor came to me and said, there's an opportunity here. Would you be okay to join the board? And I said, well, I would be okay to join the board, but I would only want to be on the board if I can invest in the business, because I don't want to just be a mouthpiece. I want to be, if you like, committed in a real way. And he said, okay, well, if you're prepared to do that, you do need to raise some money. Actually advised by Deloitte at the time. And we structured an investment where, partly debt, partly equity, but also I joined the board. And that was a fascinating. I'd spent 30 years talking to airlines, startups, scale downs, reorgs, restructures. I learned more, I would say, through that early stage launch of Emerald, because it was, we forget how difficult not the COVID period was from an aviation perspective, because from an aviation perspective everything was grounded. The recovery, the ramp up from airports being closed to being open again, and for a startup airline to be dealing with all of the challenges of, we have to source a fleet of airplanes, we have to source hundreds of people to come work in the business, we have to source ground handling, we have to do, right? It was a huge, it was a challenge like that, and not helped by the fact that, a lot of the airports, a lot of the infrastructure around aviation and airlines was totally asleep, and there was no robust plans in place to get things. So fine, you could sign up a ground handling deal with a ground handler, but they actually had no people to service the contract that they were signing with you. So you're going, great, that's ground handling sorted, we're done there in these airports, whatever. But actually what you've done is you've signed a contract that has no substance behind it. So then as you start operations, you find, why are our flights been delayed every day? So, well, there's nobody there to do the baggage. There's nobody there to do the passenger transportation. So that's where it came from. It's been a very, very interesting, very challenging in terms of just the macro space journey. But there is a fantastic team of people in there. There's a management team, and we recruited a fantastic CEO, Keith Butler, and it's, we're now at 18 airplanes. The traffic numbers are looking good. This summer is looking good. We have two airlines. We've one in the UK in order to facilitate our Belfast base, whatever. So it's been very, very interesting. But having dealt with airlines for 30 years, I have even a newfound level of respect for the management teams of airlines. The amount of variables that can impact your business and impact your bottom line, impact the stability of your business, that are totally beyond your control. Obvious ones like weather or whatever, but then, security incidents. It's just third-party providers whose business is not, is not robust enough or whatever. It is amazing that any airline in the world makes $1, let alone some of them who are, fantastically profitable. But Emerald is going well. We've certainly broken the back of the startup phase. So now we're a maturing airline. We have lots of challenges, but we also have huge number of opportunities, over 500 people working in the airline now. And, we're already planning for next summer, planning for what opportunities might be in the marketplace. So yeah, very, very interesting.
Another fantastic success story. We are actually coming up to time and we've run over. So I'm going to just ask two more last questions, if that's all right. One is, and I'll give them both to you, you can answer them as you want. One is, we have a number of graduates, if there's any advice on people starting out in a career after listening through years. And then also, what's your proudest achievement over a 30-year career, which is still continuing, but you've obviously left a legacy behind you in the aircraft finance, which is a global leader for Ireland. It's something that Ireland's very proud of. Is there something you in particular are very proud of? And I would just say, just before you answer that, there is a book that Avolon produced on the history of aviation in Ireland, which is a fantastic read. I have it at home.
Pioneers in Aviation.
Yes, Pioneers in Aviation. You can see an electronic copy online on Avolon's website with videos. If you can get your hands on a hard copy, I highly recommend it. It is something that you keep going back to on a regular basis, and it certainly has a treasure place in my house. But John, just to come back to my questions. Advice for the graduates and your proudest achievement.
So, I'd be very wary of trying to be prescriptive in terms of advice, but I can tell you what worked for me was I found something that a sector I was actually interested in, that excited me, and that I just found it to be fascinating. And for me, that was aircraft financing and aircraft leasing, or just say aviation generally, but specifically that slice. And I think that for me is the bedrock, because it's not about it's not about sort of an algorithm that I've worked out the best place for me to work is in hardware sales this year because I can make the most money, and this there has to be something intrinsically interesting that excites you. And so find what that is. Now, if you're doing this course in aviation finance, maybe you're there already because of that. And in which case then, so follow that, right? That's actually what's going to deliver for you that the energy level, the interest level, the work ethic or whatever that you need in order to be successful. So, and then I think you've got to be authentic. And that is, again, that might sound a little bit sort of self-serving, whatever. I just mean, if you can deal with people in as straight a manner as you possibly can, colleagues, bosses, if you're in a management position, people who are reporting to you, just try and be straight with people. People respond to that. You know yourself, if you're watching TV or whatever, when somebody's sort of delivering a corporate message or delivering a script, and when somebody's being authentic. And you respond to those two things very, very differently. So I think be passionate, follow your passion, and be authentic. In terms of, Ireland's space in the aircraft leasing and aircraft financing sector, I contributed some small part to that. Lots of other people contributed as well, back to the days of, Tony Ryan and many, many, many others. So that is a collective win, including, by the way, a lot of the professional services firms like Deloitte, like the big law firms, where they skilled up and spooled up in order to support this, what was a nascent industry, which has become a global industry. So there's a lot of people, it's not can take credit, a lot of people have contributed to that success. I suppose I'm most proud of the fact that, we started a company called Avolon with 11 people, and that's 14 years ago, and that company is still there today. Like I say, in the news this morning, $750 million of a new facility. The people who are running that business today came in, learned to some degree the industry, learned that they inherited the reins from a bunch of us fogies who are gone now, and they in time, I hope, will pass the reins on. That's not to put pressure on anybody in Avolon, but that to me is fantastically rewarding because I can drive past it, I can read about it in the news, I can meet people, I still do, who I worked with, And all I hear is, interesting stories, and we've done this, we've done that. And, you mentioned the book. So linked to the Avalon, if you like, my pride piece on Avalon and what it continues to achieve. When we launched that book, we did it out in Baldonnel I'm going to say 2014, 2015. I can't remember. But at the time, Enda Kenny was Taoiseach. And we were told that he would come out. We agreed with the Air Corps that we could have access to the hangar to host the event. It was a beautiful evening. The Air Corps were doing flights around, allowing people go up in airplanes and fly. It was just a fantastic backdrop. My dad was in the Air Corps, right? So this may be root cause of how I ended up in aviation, but he wasn't in the Air Corps when I was, around. He had been in the Air Corps as an engineer back in the late 40s, but he was in Baldonnel. And Enda Kenny came out, and we were told by his PA, he's going to be here for 20 minutes. He probably won't even make a speech, right? 2.5 hours later, Enda Kenny was still going around doing photo ops with people, and I ended up chatting to him, right? And he said, "Oh, this is fantastic. It's a fantastic book and all that." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "It's great for me because my dad was actually in the Air Corps here." He's like, "What?" He get me a pen, and he got one of the books, and he wrote in Irish, right? Because he's a teacher, right? In beautiful handwriting. Basically, the translation of it was like addressed to my dad. Thank you for your service to the state. And the history continues, whatever, with your son, whatever, signed Taoiseach, Enda Kenny. So I was like, okay, that's here I am in a hangar that my dad probably worked in with the Prime Minister of our country, who has given us the whole bloody evening. Where we were told that he might not come at all, he might give us 20 minutes, and he's giving a handwritten sort of salute to my dad, who had passed on at that stage. So that's linked to that wouldn't have happened without the Avalon story.
That was fantastic. A great way to finish it. Thank you very much, John, for coming in and seeing us. I really appreciate it.
One thing to say, I can't get anybody a job or anything, but the reason I was open to do this thing, because I tend not to do sort of this type of stuff, was the fact that it's graduates, students, whatever. So you have my contact details. If somebody has a specific question, wants to bounce something off me, I'm happy to have those conversations, but not, I have a specific question, how can I get a job in Avalon or AirCap or whatever. But if somebody wants to talk about something or has an idea, whatever, you have my contact details. So if you don't mind acting as a conduit, I'd be happy to.
Thank you, John. That's very generous of you, and really appreciate your time today. And I think, it felt like we were sitting in the pub having a chat, so it was one a bit early for a drink, yeah. But so thanks very much for everybody joining, and hopefully we'll see you again next quarter. Thank you.
Cheers.